When 16-year-old Lena's violin practice draws complaints from her bitter neighbor, Mrs. Charlotte, it feels like a personal attack on her dreams of winning a prestigious music competition. But as the tension escalates, Lena discovers that the real reason behind Mrs. Charlotte's anger is more personal and painful than she could have ever imagined. Will Lena's music bring healing, or will it silence her passion forever? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Lena Jackson had always felt most alive when she had her violin in her hands. It was a sunny afternoon, and as usual, Lena was in her small, cozy bedroom practicing for the upcoming state music competition. The soft, rich notes of the violin filled the room, then drifted out of the open window, spreading over the neighborhood like a gentle breeze. To Lena, every note was a step toward her dream of one day becoming a professional musician. She had been working tirelessly for months, perfecting her performance piece, a complex and emotional composition that would push her skills to the limit. Music wasn't just something she did. It was her voice, her way of expressing all the things she couldn't say with words. It gave her a sense of purpose and helped her deal with the pressures of being a teenager in a world that often seemed to demand more from her than it did from others. As a 16-year-old black girl living in a quiet, mostly white suburb with her single mother, Lena sometimes felt out of place, like she was always being watched or judged. Still, she had learned to block out those feelings. She focused on her music instead, on every bow stroke, on the intricate dynamics of the piece she was practicing, and on how the notes made her feel. Today was no different, or so she thought. Just as she was starting to lose herself in the music, the sound of a door slamming shut interrupted her. At first, she tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the wind. But the loud knock on her front door made her freeze. From her window, she saw Mrs. Charlotte marching up to her house, her mouth set in a thin, angry line. Mrs. Charlotte had always been a bit of a mystery. She lived alone in the house across the street, and while she wasn't exactly friendly, she also wasn't outright rude. Until now, it seemed. Mrs. Charlotte was known for being very particular about her lawn, her flowers, and most of all, her peace and quiet. Lena hurried downstairs, wondering what could have upset her neighbor so much. She could hear her mother, Sarah, opening the door, and Mrs. Charlotte's voice rose in agitation. "Is there something wrong?" Lena heard her mother ask. "There certainly is," Mrs. Charlotte snapped. "That girl," she pointed at Lena, who had just reached the door, "has been making an awful racket for hours. This is a quiet neighborhood, and we don't need that noise polluting the air." Lena blinked in surprise. "It's just music. I'm practicing for a competition next month. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." Mrs. Charlotte crossed her arms, her face red with anger. "Music? That's not music. It's a bunch of screeching and noise. I've had enough. I've been patient, but it's too much. I shouldn't have to listen to that all day." Sarah stepped in before Lena could respond, her voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, Mrs. Charlotte, my daughter is preparing for an important event. She's passionate about her music, and she's worked hard for this competition. Surely, there's some way we can work this out." But Mrs. Charlotte was unmoved. "Passion or not, it's disturbing the peace. This neighborhood isn't meant for loud performances. Maybe you should find somewhere more suitable for her practice." Her tone was cold, and though she didn't say it outright, Lena felt the sting of what Mrs. Charlotte was implying. Lena stood there, speechless, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The words hung in the air, heavy and bitter. She had heard that tone before, in whispers at school or when strangers glanced her way in stores, as if she didn't belong. But this time, it was in her own neighborhood, right at her front door. Her mother, sensing Lena's distress, calmly addressed Mrs. Charlotte again. "We'll do our best to keep the noise down, but please understand, Lena has a right to pursue her dreams just like anyone else." Mrs. Charlotte huffed, clearly unsatisfied. "Well, I've had enough. You better make sure it doesn't happen again, or I'll have to take this further." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back across the street, leaving Lena and her mother standing in the doorway. As soon as Mrs. Charlotte disappeared into her house, Sarah turned to Lena and put a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Lena nodded, but the knot in her stomach told a different story. I don't get it. It's just music. Why does she hate it so much? Sarah sighed, guiding Lena back inside. Some people don't understand, honey. They see something they don't like, or something they don't understand, and they react with anger. It's not about you. It's about them. Lena bit her lip, fighting back the frustration welling up inside her. She didn't want to cry over this, but the anger was building, mixing with a deep sense of unfairness. How could someone dismiss something so important to her as nothing more than noise? She had put her heart and soul into her music, and now it felt like all of that didn't matter. I was really trying to keep the volume down, Lena said quietly, more to herself than to her mother. I know, baby, Sarah said softly. You're doing great. Don't let this get to you. Some people will always have something to say no matter what you do. Lena nodded again, but the doubt had already started creeping in. The violin, which had always felt like an extension of herself, now felt like a burden, something that made her stand out in a way she didn't want to. As much as she tried to shrug it off, the words stuck with her. That night, Lena lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. She thought about the competition, about her performance, and about how she could balance practicing without causing any more trouble. The competition was her chance to prove herself, to show the world that she was more than just a girl from the neighborhood who made noise. But now, that confidence was beginning to falter. Would she ever be able to play her music without feeling like she had to apologize for it? Could she still believe in her dream, knowing that not everyone would see the beauty in what she loved? Lena woke up the next morning with a weight pressing on her chest. The encounter with Mrs. Charlotte from the day before lingered in her mind, making it hard to shake the feeling that her music, something that had always been a source of joy, was now the cause of conflict. She stared at her violin case across the room, feeling an unfamiliar hesitation. Usually, by this time, she would already be practicing, her fingers dancing across the strings, but today, it was as if her instrument was mocking her, daring her to pick it up and make noise again. After a long sigh, she sat up in bed and stretched, trying to shake off the negative thoughts, but no matter how hard she tried, they followed her like a shadow. Downstairs, her mother was busy preparing breakfast. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the air, but even that comforting scent did little to lift Lena's spirits. "Good morning, honey," Sarah greeted her with a smile as Lena entered the kitchen. "How are you feeling?" Lena shrugged. "Fine, I guess." She reached for a glass of orange juice, but her movements were slow and heavy, like she was dragging herself through the motions. Sarah watched her daughter carefully, noticing the way her usually bright eyes seemed dimmed by something deeper. "I know yesterday was hard," she said gently, "but you can't let one person's opinion stop you from doing what you love." Lena nodded, but the knot in her chest only tightened. It feels like no matter what I do, it's always going to be a problem for someone. I wasn't even being that loud, and she acted like I was doing something wrong just by playing my violin." "Some people just don't understand," Sarah said, sitting down at the table across from Lena. "And sometimes they don't want to understand. But that doesn't mean you're in the wrong. Your music is important, Lena. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Lena wanted to believe her mother's words. She wanted to feel the same certainty she had felt before, but doubt had taken root in her mind, and it wasn't going away easily. Later that day at school, Lena's mood didn't improve. She walked through the crowded hallways with her head down, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Normally, she would have her earbuds in, listening to music during every spare moment, but today, the silence felt like a barrier between her and the rest of the world. In her first class, she sat quietly, not saying much, just trying to focus on the teacher's voice. But she couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Charlotte's harsh words, replaying over and over again in her head. At lunch, Lena sat with her usual group of friends, but even there, the conversation seemed distant. Her friends chatted about the latest gossip, about boys, and about weekend plans, but Lena didn't feel like joining in. When they asked her about the music competition, she forced a smile and gave them short answers, not wanting to dive into the details of how she had almost stopped practicing. "Are you okay?" her friend Rachel asked, noticing Lena's unusual quietness. "Yeah, I'm fine," Lena lied, not wanting to bring up the confrontation with Mrs. Charlotte. She didn't want to seem like she was complaining or making excuses. Besides, what could they really say? It wasn't like her friends could make the problem go away. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time Lena got home, she was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. Her violin was waiting for her, as it always was, but she still couldn't bring herself to pick it up. Instead, she wandered into the living room, where her mother was folding laundry while the TV played softly in the background. Lena flopped onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. "I didn't practice today," she said quietly after a long silence. Sarah paused and looked at her daughter with concern. "That's not like you." Lena shrugged. I don't know if it matters anymore. What if I'm just annoying everyone? What if no one cares about my music but me?" Sarah set the laundry aside and sat next to Lena. "Lena, your music matters. It matters because it's yours. You've worked so hard for this competition, and you're so talented. Don't let other people's negativity hold you back." "But what if it's not enough?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not enough?" Sarah sighed, wrapping an arm around Lena's shoulders. "You are more than enough, Lena. You have a gift, and you've never let anything stop you before. Don't let this stop you now." Lena didn't answer. The words were comforting, but the doubt was still there, nagging at her, pulling her down. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something, teetering between giving up and pushing forward. And right now, giving up seemed a lot easier. That night, Lena lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling. Her violin sat in the corner of her room, untouched. She couldn't remember the last time she had gone a full day without playing. It was strange, almost unsettling, to be separated from something that had always been such a central part of her life. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she glanced at it, expecting another pointless notification from social media. But it wasn't. It was a message from her music teacher, Mrs. Roberts. "Hope you're practicing hard. I know you're going to crush it at the competition. You've got real talent, Lena. Keep pushing." Lena stared at the message, reading it over and over again. Mrs. Roberts had always been her biggest supporter, always pushing her to aim higher and believe in her own abilities. But what if she was wrong? What if Mrs. Roberts had overestimated her? Before Lena could spiral further into her doubts, she heard her mother's voice from downstairs, talking to a friend on the phone. Lena recognized the voice of Mrs. Daniels, a close family friend who had known Lena since she was a baby. Lena wasn't eavesdropping, but she couldn't help overhearing snippets of their conversation. They were talking about the struggles of being different, about the way people sometimes judged you without even knowing you. Her mother's voice was soft but steady as she spoke about how hard it could be to stay true to yourself when the world seemed determined to put you in a box. "You just have to keep going," Sarah said. "You can't let other people's ignorance stop you from doing what you love." Lena felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. Her mother's words felt like they were directed at her, even though she knew they weren't. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. The doubt didn't disappear completely, but it loosened its grip, just a little. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe she couldn't let one person's opinion, or even 100 people's opinions, define her. She had come too far to give up now. Lena sat up in bed, her eyes drifting to her violin case once again. She knew what she had to do. Slowly, she got out of bed and crossed the room, her fingers brushing over the case as she opened it. The familiar weight of the violin in her hands felt comforting, like reconnecting with an old friend. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath before placing the bow on the strings. And then, with a quiet resolve, she began to play. The music was soft at first, hesitant, but it grew stronger with each note, filling the room with the sound of her determination. Lena knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for now, she had found her way back to what mattered most. Lena had finally found the courage to play again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her music might still be unwelcome in her own home. Although her resolve was strengthened, every note she played came with a hint of hesitation, as if she was constantly waiting for another knock on the door. Another reminder that she didn't belong. A few days passed without incident, and Lena began to settle back into her routine. She practiced after school, keeping the volume low and the windows closed to avoid any further complaints. But the joy she once felt when playing her violin wasn't quite the same. It was as though her music had become a secret, something to be hidden, and that realization made her heart heavy. One afternoon, as Lena was practicing in the living room while her mother was at work, she heard a car pull up in front of the house. She glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Charlotte stepping out of her car holding a stack of papers. Instantly, Lena's heart raced. Was she going to complain again? Had the low volume not been enough? She half expected Mrs. Charlotte to come storming over, but instead, she saw the older woman pause at her mailbox, sorting through her mail slowly. Lena sighed, feeling the tension in her shoulders. She didn't want another confrontation, especially not while her mother wasn't home to buffer the situation. She tried to focus on her music, determined not to let Mrs. Charlotte's presence unnerve her. But a few minutes later, her doorbell rang. Her first thought was to ignore it. She wasn't in the mood to deal with anyone, least of all Mrs. Charlotte. But when the doorbell rang again, Lena knew she couldn't avoid it. She carefully set her violin down, her heart pounding as she made her way to the door. When she opened it, Mrs. Charlotte stood there, her face as stern as ever. Lena braced herself for the worst. "I need to speak to you," Mrs. Charlotte said curtly. Lena swallowed, already feeling the frustration building. "If this is about my music—" "It is," Mrs. Charlotte interrupted. Her tone was sharp, but something in her expression stopped Lena from closing the door. "But not for the reason you think." Lena blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, as if she was weighing her next words carefully. She glanced down at the ground, avoiding Lena's eyes. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if the admission was painful for her. "He loved music. Classical music, especially." Lena stood in silence, unsure of where this conversation was going. Mrs. Charlotte's demeanor had shifted from anger to something more vulnerable, and it took Lena by surprise. "We used to listen to it every evening," Mrs. Charlotte continued, her gaze distant. "He would turn on the radio, and we'd sit there together, sometimes in silence, just enjoying the music. After he passed, I couldn't stand to hear it anymore. It was too much, too painful." For the first time, Lena saw something more than just the angry neighbor who had scolded her. She saw a woman who had been carrying the weight of loss and grief for years, and it suddenly made sense why music had become a source of irritation for her. "I didn't realize," Lena said softly. "I'm really sorry." Mrs. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shook her head. "It's not your fault, Lena. I shouldn't have taken it out on you. But when I heard your music, it brought back memories I wasn't ready to face." Lena didn't know what to say. She had never thought about how her music might affect someone else on such a deep, emotional level. All this time, she had seen Mrs. Charlotte as someone who just didn't like her or what she stood for. But now, standing in front of her, she realized that there was so much more beneath the surface. "I can't pretend that I'll ever enjoy hearing it," Mrs. Charlotte admitted, her voice firm but not unkind. "But I do understand that it's important to you. I won't bother you about it anymore, as long as you're mindful of the time and volume." Lena nodded, feeling a mix of relief and empathy. "I'll make sure to keep it down, and I'll practice earlier in the day. I don't want to cause any trouble." Mrs. Charlotte gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Good." She paused for a moment, glancing at Lena's violin that was still resting on the couch behind her. "You're talented, Lena. It's obvious that music means a lot to you. I didn't mean to undermine that." Lena was taken aback. It was the first time Mrs. Charlotte had said anything remotely positive about her playing. "Thank you," Lena said, her voice tinged with genuine surprise. "That means a lot." Mrs. Charlotte gave a small, tight smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Without another word, she turned and headed back toward her house, leaving Lena standing in the doorway, still trying to process what had just happened. As Lena closed the door and returned to her violin, her mind raced with conflicting emotions. She felt bad for Mrs. Charlotte, for the grief she had been carrying, and for the way her music had unintentionally reopened old wounds. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of victory, small as it was. Mrs. Charlotte had made a concession, an acknowledgement that Lena's music mattered. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a step forward. That evening, Lena practiced her violin with a newfound energy. There was still a lingering sense of tension, knowing that Mrs. Charlotte could probably hear her music from across the street. But now, instead of hostility, there was an understanding between them, however fragile it might be. Over the next few days, Lena noticed small changes in Mrs. Charlotte's behavior. While the older woman still kept to herself, she no longer glared at Lena when she saw her outside, and there were no more complaints about the music. Lena began to relax, slowly allowing herself to enjoy playing again without the constant fear of judgment. One afternoon, as Lena was packing up her violin to head to her lessons, she saw something that caught her off guard. Mrs. Charlotte was sitting on her porch, a cup of tea in her hand, listening. Her face was unreadable, but she wasn't angry, just thoughtful. Lena couldn't help but wonder if, deep down, Mrs. Charlotte was remembering the music she had once loved with her husband. Lena didn't say anything, but as she walked past, she gave a small wave. To her surprise, Mrs. Charlotte nodded in return, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small crack in the wall that had once stood between them. Lena returned home that evening with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't expected to reach any kind of understanding with Mrs. Charlotte, let alone this fragile truce. It wasn't a friendship, and it probably never would be, but it was a step toward something better. And in a neighborhood where she had always felt like an outsider, that small step felt like a victory. In the weeks that followed, Lena continued her preparations for the music competition. Her confidence grew with every practice session, and slowly, the hesitation she had once felt began to fade away. The competition was approaching fast, but this time she felt ready. Ready to show the world what she could do, and ready to prove, to herself and to everyone else, that her music wasn't just noise. But more than anything, Lena had learned an important lesson. That sometimes the people who seem the most difficult to reach are the ones who need understanding the most. And while she didn't expect Mrs. Charlotte to ever fully embrace her music, she was grateful for the small connection they had forged, a connection built on respect, however tentative. The day of the competition loomed closer, and Lena felt a mixture of excitement and nerves simmering inside her. She had been preparing for this for months, yet now that the day was almost here, doubt began to creep in again. Would her performance be enough? Would the judges see the passion and hard work she had put into every note, or would they dismiss her as just another amateur? These thoughts swirled through her mind as she practiced in the living room one evening. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming quietly to herself while preparing dinner, occasionally calling out words of encouragement. "You sound amazing, Lena. You're going to blow them away," Sarah said, her voice full of pride. Lena smiled faintly, though her stomach was still in knots. "Thanks, Mom. I just want everything to be perfect." "It already is," her mother replied. "You've done the work, and now it's time to show them what you've got. Just believe in yourself." Lena nodded, though her nerves were hard to shake. She played through the piece one more time, focusing on the delicate, intricate passages where the emotions of the music truly shined. As she drew the final note, she let the sound linger in the air, feeling the weight of everything she had poured into the performance. There was a brief silence, broken only by the soft sound of applause from the doorway. Lena turned, her heart skipping a beat. It was Mrs. Charlotte, standing just outside the open door, her hands clasped together in a rare display of approval. Lena blinked, taken aback by her neighbor's presence. "Mrs. Charlotte?" The older woman gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. "That was quite good," she said, her voice quieter than usual. For a moment, Lena didn't know how to respond. The last thing she had expected was for Mrs. Charlotte to listen to her play again, let alone offer a compliment. "Thank you," Lena said softly. Mrs. Charlotte shifted on her feet, glancing toward the street as if debating whether to say more. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she added, "I've heard you practicing. I didn't think I would ever say this, but it reminds me of something I haven't thought about in a long time." Lena's curiosity piqued. "What's that?" Mrs. Charlotte looked at her for a long moment before responding. "My husband. He loved music. Classical music like you play. There were nights when we'd sit together and he'd put on one of his favorite records. I never thought I'd be able to enjoy hearing music again after he passed. Lena felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected this level of vulnerability from Mrs. Charlotte. The sharp-tongued woman who had once scolded her for making noise now stood before her, softened by the weight of memories. "I didn't know," Lena said gently. Mrs. Charlotte nodded. "I didn't expect you to. I suppose I've been unfair to you." Lena didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, feeling a quiet understanding pass between them. Mrs. Charlotte's presence in that moment felt like more than just a truce. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps even an apology in its own way. After a beat of silence, Mrs. Charlotte cleared her throat. "You have a real talent, Lena. Don't let anyone take that from you." And with that, she turned and walked back across the street, leaving Lena standing in the doorway, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The next day, Lena stood backstage at the music competition, her violin in hand. The buzzing of the audience beyond the curtain was almost overwhelming, but she tried to focus on her breathing, on staying calm. Her hands felt clammy, and her stomach churned with anxiety. All the practice, all the hours she had spent perfecting her performance, it had all led to this moment. The auditorium was packed with competitors, families, and music lovers. Lena could see the other performers pacing nervously or chatting with their parents. She felt a pang of insecurity watching some of the others rehearse quietly, their fingers moving deftly over their instruments. They looked so confident, so sure of themselves. Did she belong here? "Lena Jackson," a voice called out, signaling that it was her turn. Her heart pounded as she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights temporarily blinding her as she faced the panel of judges. She could barely make out the faces of the audience in the dimly lit room, but she knew they were all watching. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned the violin under her chin. For a moment, the weight of it all felt unbearable. The doubts flooded back in full force. What if she messed up? What if the judges didn't see the passion she had poured into her music? What if, after all this, she wasn't good enough? But then, as her fingers settled on the strings and the bow met the violin, she remembered why she was here. Music wasn't about impressing others. It wasn't about seeking validation from a panel of judges. It was about expressing herself, about telling a story through sound, about connecting with something deeper inside her. With that thought in mind, Lena closed her eyes and began to play. The opening notes were soft, delicate, like a whisper of emotion. But as the piece progressed, the music swelled, growing louder and more intense, as if it were carrying Lena's very soul with it. She lost herself in the melody, letting the music speak for her. Every note, every bow stroke, was infused with the feelings she had carried throughout this journey. Her frustration, her hope, her resilience. The audience seemed to fade away as Lena became completely immersed in the performance. She no longer cared about whether the judges would be impressed. She didn't even care if she won. All that mattered in that moment was the music, the way it flowed through her and out into the world. As the final notes rang out and the music came to a gentle close, Lena slowly opened her eyes. There was a brief moment of silence, and for a split second, she wondered if she had made a mistake, if the audience had been unmoved. But then the applause started. Soft at first, then building into a thunderous roar. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering, and for the first time in a long time, Lena felt truly seen. She glanced toward the judges' table, and to her surprise, she saw tears in the eyes of one of the judges, a stern-looking woman who had been stoic throughout the other performances. Lena's heart swelled with pride, knowing that she had made an impact, that her music had reached someone. As she walked off stage, her hands still trembling from the intensity of the performance, she spotted a familiar face in the audience. Mrs. Charlotte. She was sitting in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, watching Lena with a small, approving nod. It was a simple gesture, but to Lena it meant everything. Later, as the competition came to a close, the judges announced the winners. Lena's heart raced as they called the names, and when they finally announced first place, her breath caught in her throat. First place goes to Lena Jackson. The room erupted into applause, but all Lena could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and steady in her ears. She had done it. She had won. As she stepped onto the stage to accept the trophy, Lena's eyes searched the crowd for her mother. Sarah was beaming with pride, tears streaming down her face. And there, standing quietly in the back, was Mrs. Charlotte. The older woman's expression was softer than Lena had ever seen it, and for the first time, Lena felt that maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Charlotte was proud of her too. When Lena returned home that evening, the weight of the competition finally lifted. She sat down with her violin once again. This time, she played not for a competition, not for the judges, but for herself. The music filled the house, light and free, and for the first time in a long time, Lena felt completely at peace. The days following the competition were a blur of congratulations and celebrations. Lena's win quickly became the talk of her school and neighborhood. Her mother had beamed with pride, retelling the story of Lena's victory to anyone who would listen. Even people who had never paid attention to Lena's music before now seemed eager to acknowledge her talent. It felt good. Better than Lena had expected. But amidst all the excitement, there was one moment that stood out to her more than anything else. Mrs. Charlotte had come to the competition. That single fact lingered in Lena's mind, replaying over and over. The same woman who had once complained so bitterly about her music had been there, quietly supporting her. It wasn't something she had ever expected, and the more she thought about it, the more it touched her. A few days after the competition, Lena found herself sitting on her porch, enjoying the rare feeling of relaxation. For once, there was no pressure to practice, no looming deadline or competition to prepare for. She could just be. She closed her eyes, letting the soft breeze wash over her, when she heard the creak of a door opening across the street. Lena opened her eyes to see Mrs. Charlotte stepping out onto her porch carrying a cup of tea. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Mrs. Charlotte sipped her tea, and Lena wondered if she should say something. Their last interaction had been so brief but significant enough that Lena couldn't let it go. Summoning her courage, Lena stood and crossed the street, her heart beating a little faster with each step. Mrs. Charlotte looked up as she approached, her expression as guarded as ever. "Hi, Mrs. Charlotte," Lena said, offering a small smile. "I just wanted to thank you for coming to the competition." Mrs. Charlotte's eyes flickered with surprise, though her face remained stoic. She nodded slightly. "You deserve to have someone there." Lena was taken aback by the simplicity and sincerity of the statement. She had expected a more awkward or distant conversation, but Mrs. Charlotte's words were straightforward and genuine. "I really appreciate it," Lena said softly. "It meant a lot to me, and I'm sorry if my practicing made things hard for you. I didn't know about your husband, or how much it hurt to hear music again." Mrs. Charlotte looked down at her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. For a long moment she said nothing, and Lena wondered if she had said too much. But then, Mrs. Charlotte spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "It's not your fault, Lena. I've held on to that pain for a long time, and I took it out on you. That was wrong." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But listening to you at the competition, it was different. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It reminded me of good memories." Lena felt a lump form in her throat. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable around Mrs. Charlotte were starting to crumble, revealing the deep grief that had fueled her anger. Lena had never imagined her music could be part of someone's healing, but in that moment she realized it had been. "I'm glad you came," Lena said quietly. I think I understand a little more now." Mrs. Charlotte gave a slight nod, her lips pressing into a thin, thoughtful line. "Your music is powerful, Lena. Don't ever doubt that." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Coming from Mrs. Charlotte, they felt like a stamp of approval, something Lena hadn't even realized she had wanted until now. For the first time, Mrs. Charlotte's expression softened, and she gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Sit with me for a moment, if you'd like." Lena hesitated only for a second before accepting the invitation. She sat down beside Mrs. Charlotte, and for a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. After a while, Mrs. Charlotte spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "You know, after my husband passed, I couldn't listen to music at all. It was too painful. I shut myself off from it, from anything that reminded me of him. But hearing you play, it reminded me of how much joy music used to bring him. And me too. I had forgotten that. Lena listened carefully, her heart heavy with empathy. She had spent so long viewing Mrs. Charlotte as the antagonist in her story, the person who stood in the way of her music. But now, seeing the pain and loss behind the older woman's anger, Lena realized that it wasn't about her music at all. It was about the memories it stirred, the grief that had never fully healed. "I'm really sorry you lost him," Lena said softly. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Mrs. Charlotte gave a small, sad smile. "It was. But life goes on, it always does. And eventually, you have to find a way to live with the memories, rather than letting them haunt you." The two sat quietly for a few more minutes, neither of them feeling the need to fill the silence with words. There was something peaceful about it, a quiet understanding that passed between them. For the first time, Lena felt like she and Mrs. Charlotte weren't just neighbors. They were two people who had, in their own ways, helped each other heal. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, Lena stood up. "Thanks for the talk," she said, her voice warm. "It was nice." Mrs. Charlotte nodded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes soft. "You're welcome, Lena. Keep playing. Don't stop, no matter what anyone says." Lena smiled, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. "I won't." She turned and made her way back across the street, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. For the first time in weeks, Lena felt at peace with everything that had happened. The competition, the conflict with Mrs. Charlotte, the doubts and insecurities, it all seemed to make sense now. The music wasn't just about proving herself to the world, it was about finding her own voice, her own path, and using it to connect with others. That evening, as Lena sat in her room with her violin, she thought about how far she had come. The competition had been a milestone, but it wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. She had learned so much, not just about music, but about people, about understanding, and about resilience. With a deep breath, Lena raised her bow and began to play, the notes flowing freely, unburdened by the weight of doubt. The music was light and beautiful, filling the room and spilling out into the evening air. And as the last note lingered, she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her music wasn't just for her anymore. It was for everyone who needed to hear it, including herself. Outside, on her porch, Mrs. Charlotte sat with her cup of tea, listening. The music no longer disturbed the peace of the neighborhood. Instead, it filled the air with a sense of harmony, a quiet reminder that even the most unlikely of connections can lead to healing, if only we allow them to. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.